Extras. As discussed ad nauseum in the episode, with a few caveats, the world of the Feywild is only approximately 8 feet deep. The closer you get to that depth, the more energy is required to dig any farther, exponentially more until the cost approaches infinity. What counts as the surface, the sea level if you will, is related to the geography of the other planes as well. There's a complex relationship where changes in one tends to affect the others in time. It's not a direct connection, but more like the inexorable tug of gravity on a celestial body, bending its path. This means if there's a mountain at location A on one plane, there is almost certainly a similarly shaped mountain on both of the other planes, and if a clash of godlike powers blasted off the top of one of those mountains, the tops of the two corresponding mountains would become more susceptible to various natural and supernatural forces until eventually rockfalls, avalanches, lightning strikes, or other calamities brought their shapes and height back into line with one another. There are even some scholars among the elves in Eladrin, who pass back and forth between the Feywild and the Fadelands more often than most peoples, who theorize that simply building a large enough fortress on one plane will bring these forces into play until either the large structure fails or falls, or construction or geological activity on the other planes bring them closer in line with the shape. But there are a lot of problems with this theory, and it seems more likely to be a confusion of correlation versus causation. If one person decides to build a major castle on a given spot, that is probably because it is a strong defensible location. And since the geography is so similar, is it more likely that the weird string theory caused a castle to be built in the same spot in the Feywild, or that another leader saw the same defensive advantage and built there for common sense reasons? That would certainly make sense. For example, when you ask why the Vampire King Swain's fortress of Old House in the Shadowfell lies in the very same spot nestled between twin mountains where King Vistria, son of the smith, decided to build a huge castle. Anyway, from a world-building perspective, I like the way this bizarre trait both makes the Feywild seem alien, even in places where it might look like an ordinary scene from the normal world, and it also draws a crazy contrast between the shallow-bottomed Fey and the seemingly bottomless depths of the Underdark in the Shadowfell. Now, Tales from my D&D campaign really blurs what information the players actually know and what I, as Game Master, have to reveal to them in the way of basic stuff the characters would definitely know. For the videos, I sometimes put this exposition into the mouths of the characters because it tells the story better, and helps make it more about them, as it should be. But in reality, sometimes they have to ask me questions, or I just have to dump exposition about how, you know, Larrick has a mixed human and halfling population, and blah blah blah. Other times, I do the same thing, but just tweak it slightly, like, Angel can tell you those pyros, the flame-headed birds, are pretty aggressive, if that's something I think she would know, but hasn't asked. Her player may also ask about something like, does Angel know anything about woodwoads? In which case, if the information is less ubiquitous, I may require a knowledge check. Knowledge the planes, knowledge local, whatever makes sense. And based on the result, she might get, if you recall correctly, woodwoads are relatively harmless, or at least not aggressive unless you invade their territory. But in this case, because I knew it would come up when they journeyed to the Feywild, I emailed Angel a bunch of information, including the 8-foot depth limit, before the session, so her player could have that little extra moment of knowing what's going on before the others. It would be silly for the character not to know, even though, when she joined the party, she had already spent more of her life in the Fadelands than in her home plane. Since Black had Draven craft his figurine of Wondrous Power for him, I saw no reason he couldn't make it look however he wants. The thing is, he paid for an elephant figurine, so even though his looks like a massive floating marble gauntlet, it has the exact same stats as the marble elephant would. It floats at a fixed level, and is affected by any terrain that would affect an elephant. The only game difference at all is that it always starts with a charge attack, An awesome downward vertical charge, to be sure, but it neither deals nor suffers falling damage. It's pure rule of cool that when Black activates the small statue, he summons the hand of justice down from the heavens upon the enemy. There had been some talk of making it a tower-shaped marble rook, like the chess piece, since that too is a symbol of Sirius, but in the end, it just feels better to have the giant fist smacking people around. I honestly can't remember if I planned the glowy little pyramids preemptively, or came up with them in response to the party's quite reasonable decision to rest in a rope trick portal. Maybe I have the sequence muddled in my head because they rested at the end of a session, so I had the week in between to come up with something to get around it. The thing about rope trick, once your caster level reaches the point where the spell lasts a whole night, is that it's a really good solution to the dangers of camping out. In fact, it's so good a solution that it is almost self-defeating from a metagame point of view. It is such a perfect easy mode for resting safely that it forces the game master to reflexively start brainstorming ways to foil it, even in circumstances where otherwise they might not have planned or even thought about any so-called random night encounters. I'm of the opinion that if a PC has chosen an ability or spell, and it's not some weird game-wrecking thing, that when they use it, your bias should be in favor of letting it be useful. In the case of rope trick, its whole purpose is ultimately reliability, the ability to rest without interruption. So every single time the GM circumvents it somehow, it feels pretty crappy. Now, an argument can be made that since it's removing an entire dimension of risk and drama, that it should be circumvented, or shouldn't exist at all. There are points to be made on either side. But here, I had two reasons for messing with it. First, it was much more of a playful thing, another reminder of the alien environment, rather than an ambush which was actually dangerous to them. And secondly, I felt that I had this interesting encounter planned, and they would miss out if they just hid in their extra-dimensional campsite all night. It was unlikely they would need another whole day and night in the Feywild at this point, and even if they did, they'd just rope trick again. So they had their incredibly irritating and yet somewhat humorous encounter with the glowy thingies, which seemed particularly attracted to this sort of magic. But being unceremoniously dumped out, they caught sight of the unusual-looking procession of spirits. There were hundreds of them, in a steady, moving queue, most of them translucent as they marched beneath the darkened sky. Some had distinct limbs, whether humanoid or in other configurations. Others of their number were more or less amorphous, moving slug-like, or like a crashing wave, or even rolling across the grassland. Some had many eyes, or none. Some wore odd masks on their faces, or incongruous hats, and they were just generally weird, fascinating, and marvelous to behold. As Orestria and others noted in the comments, these beings were clearly the sort of thing one might see in a Hayao Miyazaki film, like Spirited Away or Howl's Moving Castle, and those were definitely a large part of my inspiration for it, and for the animistic themes that exist throughout TDDC's setting. Ours is far from a full-on animist world. The vast majority of the time a rock is just a rock. But there are many animals, places, and other features which are or have divine spirits, and this becomes much more common and more apparent as soon as you leave the Fadelands for the other two even more magical worlds. I'm not exactly a huge Miyazaki fan, as I find most of his films to be rather weak or incomplete as films, but a lot of that is probably due to cultural differences and my lack of knowledge of and connection to Japanese folklore. And also, I think you have to look at them less as films and more as animated storytelling works of art. To be a great movie, you need a great deal of synergy between the presentation, story, and characters, and I find Miyazaki's works tend to fall down a little in that way. But they are still great somethings, and the best I can come up with is to say that they are great works of art. There's a tremendous imagination and animation. There are great characters, and characters I don't find appealing, which are nevertheless fascinating and special, and there's plenty of emotion. So, amidst my pale imitation, and the video is a really crappy version, as this is one of those pure theater of the mind moments where I let the players' imaginations do most of the work, and any attempt by me to put it into images was doomed to failure. I did enough to sort of give you the idea, and didn't stress too much about it. If you've seen the fluidity of Miyazaki's animation, you know I would be nuts to even waste my time trying. For what it's worth, I haven't seen any of his stuff in at least a year, and I made a point of not looking for examples to copy, but just drew whatever compromise spirit things I could manage based on my own memories and limited art capacity. The tall one, though, I spent a little more time on because that was the thing which, while still being very abstract, I had a pretty clear mental image of. And I'm fairly proud of him because, for all the simplicity of his look, it was not necessarily an easy thing for me to capture. A very tall, black thing, almost featureless save for the eyes, which are themselves not very visible unless he meets your gaze, seen mainly as a dark shape moving in front of the very dense starscape of the Feywild. I probably should have drawn a lot more stars to give the right idea, but I also didn't want to take away from the fact that the tall one was not all that easy to make out. And this thing, which I'm trying to draw, is obviously very tall, but it's supposed to be impossible to tell how tall. And then he uses his indeterminate height to reach down, take this very tiny object, the pebble, then reach all the way up and place it among the stars? I've said that in our cosmos, the astral sea may well be a two-dimensional space bent into a spherical shell around the world, but even so, it is very far away. That what the tall one appeared to do had to be either an illusion or something closer to a miracle than any logical, sensible thing. So there it is, a giant lake of expanding, apparently corrosive, green goo. There was a spirit, a tiny thing, usually too small to be seen by the naked eye, which slipped quietly along the forest floor, slowly breaking down bones and fallen trees as it went. The spirit was the embodiment of the force of decay within the Nilly woods, maintaining the balance between things that grow and things that die. But the spirit was only one side of that balance. The trees, the brush, the animals, and insects were the other side. Whenever this tiny spirit encountered a thing that was not alive, but which was too big or too hard to devour, it would puff itself up until it was big enough to score the object's surface, before continuing on its rounds. After all, if it stayed in one place long enough to devour a large rock, all the rest of its work would suffer and be left unfinished. So it would grow until it could leave some mark, even a tiny scratch on a rock or bone, then continue on its way, shrinking back to normal size and patrolling the entire woods. Each time it passed, another scratch, and in time the bones and even the rocks would break, and the balance would be maintained. But then, not so long ago, the spirit ran into a shiny thing. It was larger than the bugs with the durable shells, but not as large as some of the rocks it had uncovered as it grazed upon the dirt of the forest floor. As it always did, the spirit puffed itself up and tried, and then again. But try as it might, it could not scratch this shiny thing. But the very smallest mark would do. One mark, and the spirit could continue on its way, for if it left but a single mark with each passing, it could devour even a mountain in time. But grow as it might, it was unable to remove even the tiniest particle from the shiny disk. But every stone has a weak point. That is the wisdom of the stream and of the root. The spirit knew this well. So the tiny spirit took a great deep breath, and grew as large as it had ever grown, licking every contour of the strange metal. But it could find no seam, no crack, no blemish upon which to work. Even the thin hair which trailed from the disk was like no fur or follicle it had ever encountered. It could not be severed nor even frayed. For the very first time, the spirit did not know what to do. The smallest mark would do, but without a mark it could not continue on its way. It despaired, gnawing helplessly upon the shiny, immutable thing, and it wished it could grow big enough to fulfill its purpose. But the disk grew warm, and the spirit grew larger still, larger than it had ever been before. It enveloped the entire metal disc, but still it could not scratch the metal, so it grew and grew and grew. It concentrated on devouring the object at its core, but even as the matter all around it was consumed, it could not affect the amulet. All it could do was continue absorbing the power, hoping to become large enough to make a mark. Although there was a fight at the end, which did work out fairly satisfyingly, the Goo adventure clearly wasn't about fighting. The quest was partially about atmosphere, discovering the Feywild, but really it was about problem-solving. And as a game master, I see two main ways to think about problem-solving encounters. One way is as a puzzle, which is to say there's only one solution, and like the detective in a mystery book, it's up to the players to find that one correct answer. Now, a lot of people like mystery novels, and a lot of people like puzzles. If you can unravel the mystery and get the solution, it can be very rewarding. But making a good puzzle is actually quite hard. If it's too difficult, or for whatever reason your players can't come up with the answer, then it can quickly get frustrating for everyone, especially if that puzzle is essential to progressing the adventure. On the other hand, an easy puzzle isn't really a puzzle. It quickly turns into something more like the Riddler's little word games, the ones Batman usually solves in 1 second flat. Good for the player's confidence, maybe, if you throw a few in there, but if it's too easy, it can hurt suspension of disbelief. And if it was supposed to be easy and for some reason they get stumped, then it's extra frustrating for everyone. The other problem-solving encounter type, or way of thinking about it, is what I call an obstacle. The other main problem-solving encounter type, or the other way to think about it, is just as an obstacle, where a puzzle has one specific solution, or maybe even a couple fixed ways to succeed. An obstacle isn't built on some presupposed solution, but rather it forces the PCs to come up with their own way to do it, which also means there could be any number of ways to succeed. For a low-level party, where magical mobility is much more limited or costly, something as simple as a chasm or a fast-flowing river to cross can pose a problem. But usually you don't drop a chasm in your dungeon with a specific solution in mind. Do they try to jump it? Maybe they go looking for a fallen tree to drop across it to serve as a bridge. Or in a dungeon there might be a pillar nearby they could knock over for that same purpose. The thing about a good obstacle is, when you lay it down, you make sure to think of at least one way to deal with it, using skills or spells that you know they have access to, or using something in the environment nearby. But whether it's a terrain feature, a monster, or a social encounter, the obstacle is just there to be overcome. In the immediate short term, it doesn't matter how they bypass it, just that they find a way. Maybe the party wants to throw a grappling hook across the chasm, or shoot an arrow with a rope tied to it into some crack. Is this reliable? I don't know, but they're heroes. It sounds like it has a chance to work, and it might be cool. Let's see some rolls. These are good ways to think about puzzles and other obstacles, but the division isn't always so clear, and the Goo is an example of this. Getting the amulet and stopping the Goo was quite a challenge. You might think it was more like a puzzle, in that they solved it almost exactly as I had guessed they would when designing it, using the spell Divination to locate the artifact, and using multiple Wall of Fire spells to get to it. In fact, when I originally came up with it, a fair number of sessions earlier, Draven had been strongly considering making himself a wand of Wall of Fire, though in the end he didn't. And they went through a lot of ideas and tested a bunch of things about the Goo before coming to these solutions, which sounds very puzzle-like. But there were also other ways they could have done it. They certainly could have flown everyone over the Goo to the rocky island where the battle took place. It would have used different spells, but a similar amount of magic to the multiple walls. It did seem a lot scarier, though, since if anything went wrong, if they got dispelled, they could find themselves swimming in a lot of d6s of damage. Or they could have dimension doored over. Still not that much cheaper in terms of spell levels if they had to door back for any reason. And plus, the fire ring seemed like a pretty good idea. Finding the amulet in the first place was a much harder problem, like a needle in a deadly haystack, but there were some other divination spells they could have used, and theoretically, They could have taken the Fey Archer's offer, allowing the Woodwoad village to be consumed. Now, I knew the odds of that happening were pretty near to zero, given the PC's personalities and the way I planned to RP Menyareth. But if they had failed to stop the goo in time, even after blowing him off, Menyareth may have helped them after his mischief was done, in exchange for some other service, probably a lot more taxing than his original stay-out-of-it offer. And they were, in the planning stage, almost certain to earn themselves some karma for the Tall One deal. Maybe with that they could have earned some help from some spirit, like the river that they passed. Though karma isn't really something you can quantify, despite how the Rajas seem to talk about it. Don't forget to like these videos, and if you want to listen to more of me, you can always follow me on Twitter at TailsDDC, on Facebook, I'm DemonacAGC, and you can find me on demonac.tumblr.com.